In the late 1880s, electricity became a weapon. Two corporate empires fought to decide what would run through America's walls, streets, and factories. This wasn't only patents and prices. It was fear, politics, and headlines. And the first real victory didn't come from a generator. It came from making the other current feel unsafe to touch. Hello, I'm William. Let's get into it. Before the war, most cities still belonged to gaslight. Streets glowed yellow. Homes smelled of fuel. Nights were dim, and everyone accepted it as normal. Then electric light arrived and rewired the idea of power. Not just brighter lamps. A new kind of control. Whoever owned the wires could sell safety, comfort, and productivity by the hour. Thomas Edison understood that better than anyone selling the dream. His system was direct current, DC. It worked like a tight neighborhood business. A generating station feeds customers close by. The farther you go, the more the power drops, and the more copper you need to push it. That limitation mattered because copper isn't theory. Copper is weight, cost, and street work. It means trenches. It means thick cables. It means crews ripping open a block to feed a few blocks more. Edison didn't hide that. He built around it. He sold DC like a controlled product. Local stations, known distances, a promise that the system was manageable. In a world afraid of new technology, manageable was a weapon. Now meet the other side. George Westinghouse wasn't a lab celebrity. He was an industrialist who had already made his name by solving a brutal problem on the rails. Air brakes turned fast trains from rolling risk into something you could actually run on schedule. He built factories, a workforce, and a mindset that cared about scale. When Westinghouse looked at DC, he saw a ceiling. Cities didn't want a few lit blocks. They wanted entire districts. They wanted factories. They wanted power that could travel. That's where alternating current, AC, enters the story as a threat. AC can be transformed. You can raise voltage to move power farther with less loss, then step it down near the customer. That single advantage turns electricity from local lighting into a network. And a network is an empire. This is the moment the fight becomes inevitable. Edison is selling a controlled grid that keeps him close to every street contract. Westinghouse is selling a system that can leap across a city and take territory faster. City officials didn't care about philosophy. They cared about outcomes. How much it costs. How fast it can expand. Who gets blamed when something goes wrong? Because something always goes wrong. By the late 1880s, American streets were filling with wires. Utility poles multiplied. Lines crossed each other overhead. In some neighborhoods, the sky looked stitched shut. Workers climbed in the rain and the dark, handling live lines with gloves that didn't always save them. Every accident became a headline. Every headline became a weapon. Edison understood this was not just engineering anymore. It was public confidence. If a city council believed one current was dangerous, it wouldn't award the contract. If a newspaper framed one system as reckless, bankers would hesitate to fund expansion. So the war opened on two fronts at once. One was the obvious front: equipment, stations, cables, and bids. The other was darker: language. Who gets to define safe? Who gets to define modern? Who gets to define deadly? Edison had prestige and a brand that sounded like progress itself. Westinghouse had a scaling technology and the nerve to push it into hostile territory. Both men had lawyers, investors, and allies who spoke to politicians. And once the wires were up, the stakes got personal fast. A bad contract could bankrupt a company. A single danger story could freeze a city. A single court ruling could lock an invention behind paper. The war of currents didn't start with a battle. It started with a choice every city had to make. Which current do we let into our walls? And once that choice became public, one side decided the best way to win was to make the other choice feel like a mistake you don't survive. Once the wires went up, the war moved into rooms most people never see. Not power stations, courtrooms, boardrooms, city contract offices, places where men in clean collars decided which current would own a street and which company would be treated like a hazard. Edison's side understood something ruthless early. You don't have to prove your system is better. You only have to make the other system feel uninsurable. One bad headline, and a city council suddenly needs more study. One lawsuit, and a contractor freezes because nobody wants to buy equipment that might be ruled illegal next month. So the first corporate shots were paper. Patent pressure became a weapon. Edison's organization had stacks of intellectual property tied to lamps, sockets, meters, and distribution hardware. If Westinghouse wanted to light a city, he wasn't just buying generators. He was stepping into a minefield of claims. An injunction could delay an installation. A delay could kill a contract, and a killed contract could starve a growing company. Westinghouse's answer was the only answer that works in a Gilded Age war. Buy the missing pieces, buy the talent, buy time. He went hunting for inventions that made AC unstoppable, not just possible. That search led him to Nikola Tesla, a brilliant, unstable force who had been working on an AC motor system that didn't rely on sparks and brute force. Tesla's polyphase ideas weren't just clever. They were a blueprint for building an AC world that could run more than lights. Westinghouse moved fast. He bought Tesla's patents and pulled him into the company's orbit. The deal wasn't charity. It was survival. With Tesla's system, AC stopped being a lighting trick and became an industrial platform. And that's when Edison's side had to change tactics, because this wasn't just about voltage anymore. It was about who gets to define the story. Accidents were happening in cities already. Wires hung too low. Lines crossed. Insulation failed. A man touched a metal object and didn't get a second chance. Newspapers didn't explain whether it was AC or DC. They just printed the word electric and let fear do the rest. Edison's camp leaned into that fear and tried to aim it. They pushed the idea that high-voltage AC was the dangerous kind, unpredictable, lethal, something you don't want near homes. They didn't need every reader to understand current. They needed the public to feel a difference between safe electricity and wild electricity. Westinghouse tried to keep the fight technical. He argued that any current can kill if you mishandle it. He pointed at engineering standards, transformers, proper installation. But technical arguments don't beat a simple emotion in a crowded city. Now add old money to the picture. This war wasn't fought only by inventors. It was fought by financiers who wanted control of the next national utility. Investors backed the systems they believed would dominate, and their pressure shaped the companies from the top down. Edison was a name that sold confidence. Westinghouse was a name that sold expansion. Both were dangerous, and both needed capital. Inside Edison's world, that capital came with strings. As the fight grew more expensive, bankers and backers gained more influence. The inventor who loved headlines mattered less than the executives who could keep the company funded and legally protected. Edison still had his brand, but the machine around him was turning into something colder than a laboratory. Westinghouse felt the squeeze too. Building AC networks required equipment, copper, crews, and constant expansion. Every lawsuit slowed cash. Every delay made lenders nervous. A power war doesn't just test technology. It tests who can stay liquid while bleeding. And by the end of the decade, both sides had learned the same lesson. A city doesn't choose a current only because it works. A city chooses the current it thinks won't bring scandal. That's why the next move was so dirty. It wasn't about winning contracts directly. It was about poisoning the idea of the competitor's current in the public mind. And this is where a new character steps onto the stage. Not a famous inventor, not a mayor, a man who presents himself like a safety crusader. He starts staging proof that one kind of electricity is designed to kill. His name is Harold P. Brown. And once Brown begins his demonstrations, the war of currents stops being a corporate fight in courtrooms. It becomes a public spectacle built around death. Harold P. Brown didn't walk into this war as an inventor. He walked in as a messenger with a mission. He showed up with a simple claim that newspapers loved to print. Alternating current wasn't just different. It was deadly, not if mishandled, deadly by nature. And he said he could prove it in public. The proof wasn't a diagram. It was a demonstration. Picture a room that smells like hot varnish and metal. A generator humming on the table. Thick cables on the floor like snakes. Reporters and officials watching because they've been invited to see safety. Brown doesn't talk like a salesman. He talks like a man trying to prevent a disaster. Then an animal is brought in. A dog. Sometimes a calf in other tests. Not because anyone in that room needs more cruelty in their life, but because fear needs a body. Brown explains voltage in plain language, points to AC, and frames it like a trap waiting for the public. He throws the switch. There's a jerk, a collapse, and a silence that makes the room feel colder. The crowd doesn't see a theory die. It sees something living stop. Brown turns toward the witnesses and acts like the conclusion is obvious. This is what AC does. That's the move. He isn't trying to educate anyone. He's trying to brand a rival current as a killer. And this is where Edison's side benefits, even without standing in the center of the room. Edison's camp had been arguing that DC was controlled, predictable, safer for homes. Brown's demonstrations were a shortcut. They gave that message a visual that stuck. A city councilman who forgets the math still remembers the moment the switch was thrown. Westinghouse understood the danger immediately. Not only moral danger, business danger. If the public begins to associate AC with death, contracts freeze. Investors hesitate. Contractors choose the safe option, even if it costs more. The war stops being about efficiency and becomes about panic. So Westinghouse fought back the only way he could at first. He tried to keep it factual. He pushed the idea that any electricity can kill. And the real issue is installation standards. Proper insulation, proper transformers, proper training. But facts don't travel as fast as a staged spectacle. Then the war got even dirtier, because a spectacle needs a stage. New York State was searching for a new method of execution. Hanging was seen as botched and ugly. Politicians wanted something they could call modern and humane. Electricity, the symbol of progress, became the answer. The logic was chilling. If electricity can light a city, it can also end a life quickly. Brown saw an opportunity, and Edison's side saw one too. if the electric chair used AC, then every execution would advertise the same message without anyone needing to buy an ad. Every newspaper headline would carry the association. Not electricity killed, Westinghouse current killed. Brown began pushing hard for AC in the chair. He didn't say it like a business move. He said it like a safety crusade. AC is more dangerous. Therefore, it should be used for executions. The argument sounds twisted because it is twisted. It takes danger and turns it into policy. Westinghouse tried to stop it before it became permanent. He didn't just complain. He put money behind legal resistance because he understood what was at stake. If the first execution happens on AC, the brand damage could be irreversible. If the execution is botched, the scandal could splash onto the entire industry, including him. Either outcome was poison. Edison, meanwhile, was playing a longer game. He had already built DC into city blocks. He had a reputation as the safe inventor. He didn't need to win every technical argument. He needed AC to carry a shadow. Inside this, Tesla becomes a strange, quiet counterweight. Tesla believed in AC as the future, but he wasn't built for courtroom mud. He cared about systems and ideas. Westinghouse cared about whether his men could build without being branded criminals. Edison cared about whether the public would trust a wire, and the public was already nervous. Wires were multiplying overhead. Cities were getting brighter, but also more dangerous. A line down in the rain could kill a passerby. A careless lineman could die on a pole. Every accident, no matter whose system caused it, fed the fear that electricity itself was a monster. That's what makes the electric chair move so powerful. It doesn't just target Westinghouse. It threatens to turn the entire age of electricity into a horror story. By 1890, one condemned man in New York becomes the pivot point. A prison prepares a chair. Officials promise humane. Newspapers promise spectacle. Brown promises proof. Westinghouse tries to block the association. Edison's side quietly benefits from the headline either way. Because once a man is strapped in and the switch is thrown, the country won't be debating volts. It will be debating what kind of power it just invited into its home. On August 6, 1890, the War of Currents walked into a prison room. A man named William Kemmler was strapped into a new device in Auburn, New York. Politicians had sold it as modern, quick, humane. The newspapers sold it as the future of punishment. And behind the scenes, both electrical camps knew what it really was. A national advertisement for what electricity means. Westinghouse didn't want his current tied to that chair. He funded Kemmler's legal fight anyway, trying to stop the precedent before it became permanent. The appeal went all the way up and failed, and the state kept the date. Once that happened, the war stopped being about wires and streets. It became about a switch in a room. Harold Brown's influence mattered here because he'd already done the public work. He'd staged demonstrations that framed AC as the easiest way to kill. That framing slid into policy. If AC is more deadly, then officials argued it must be the best execution method. It's a circular argument dressed like science. The morning of the execution, witnesses watched the chair as if it were a machine being tested. The current hit, then failed to finish the job cleanly. The room went from confident to panicked fast, and a second surge followed. People described smoke, a sickening smell, and a silence that felt nothing like humane. It wasn't just a death. It was a botched spectacle. That should have killed the propaganda value. In a normal world, it would. But this was the Gilded Age. The point wasn't truth. The point was association. Edison's side didn't need the chair to look clean. They needed the headline to stick. They pushed for language that made Westinghouse's name sound like a verb for death. Westinghouse. The ugliness of the event became a tool, because fear doesn't care who caused the failure. Fear only remembers what it touched. Westinghouse understood the trap. If the country begins to say AC equals execution, then every city contract becomes harder. Not because engineers are confused, but because mayors don't want scandal. Bankers don't want lawsuits. Newspapers don't want nuance. They want a simple villain. And the chair didn't just stain Westinghouse. It stained electricity itself. Linemen were already dying on poles. Wires were already falling in storms. City streets already looked like a jungle of cables. After Auburn, every accident felt like proof that power belonged in a cage, not above a sidewalk. This is the moment Edison's public brand hits its peak. Safety stops being a feature. It becomes a moral position. His camp could point at the chair and imply they were saving families from that future, even if the chair had nothing to do with lighting a home. But the war had a problem that propaganda couldn't fully solve. Reality keeps scoring points in the background. Cities wanted distance. They wanted expansion without building a generating station every few blocks. They wanted a system that could grow beyond a single neighborhood. And every time a city asked for scale, AC had a technical answer that DC struggled to match. So after Auburn, you get a strange split. On the front page, electricity looks like a threat. In the contract rooms, electricity looks like the biggest opportunity in America. And in the boardrooms, old money financiers start asking a colder question than which is safer. Which standard will own the future long enough to justify the money? That's where the war turns again. Because if Edison's side used a public spectacle to paint AC as death, Westinghouse now needed a public spectacle to paint AC as dominance. And the next spectacle wasn't going to happen in a prison. It was going to happen in a city that wanted the world to watch it glow. The next battlefield wasn't a courtroom or a prison. It was a city trying to prove it owned the future. Chicago was preparing the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, a giant public promise that America had arrived. If you could light the fair, you didn't just win a contract. You won the public's nerves. Millions of people would walk through those gates, look up, and decide whether electricity felt like progress or like a threat. Edison's side understood the stakes. By now, the Edison Company was bigger than Edison. Bankers and executives had taken over the steering wheel, and the electrical business was consolidating into something that looked like old money infrastructure. J.P. Morgan was the kind of man who hated uncertainty, and he pushed toward a cleaner corporate machine, one that could compete at scale without the drama of inventors arguing in public. That's the quiet twist most people miss. Edison's name stayed on the front, but behind the front, control was shifting. The business was being engineered into a unified corporate weapon. The war of currents wasn't just Edison versus Westinghouse anymore. It was Westinghouse versus a financial structure that wanted to own the standard. Then the fair contract came up, and the war hit its rawest point. Westinghouse did what a challenger has to do against a better-funded machine. He underbid. Hard. He didn't win by promising the safest system. He won by promising the biggest spectacle for the least money, and he was willing to take pain to get it. And the pain was real. His side needed an ocean of lamps, cables, dynamos, transformers. Crews had to install everything fast. Every delay would be blamed on AC. Every accident would be turned into a headline. Westinghouse wasn't just fighting a competitor. He was fighting the expectation that his system would fail in public. Tesla became crucial here, not as a salesman, but as a symbol that AC wasn't a hack. Tesla's presence and his demonstrations gave AC an aura of science and inevitability. Westinghouse needed that, not because the public understood induction, because the public senses confidence, and confidence sells safety better than any pamphlet. When the fair opened and the lights came on, it didn't feel like technology. It felt like the night itself was being pushed back. Buildings glowed white. Walkways were lit like daylight. Water and stone reflected electric brightness in a way gas lamps could never do. You could stand in the crowd and watch people's faces change as they realized they weren't looking at an experiment. They were looking at a standard. This is the moment the propaganda starts to lose oxygen. Because you can call AC dangerous all you want, but when millions of people walk through an AC-lit city and nothing collapses, fear has to compete with memory. And memory is heavier. But the war wasn't over, because Edison's side still had a play: tighten corporate control and win the next contracts with law, financing, and political leverage. The utilities business wasn't only about which current worked. It was about who could finance the build-out, who could secure city permissions, who could survive long fights. That's where the old money layer becomes obvious. Electricity was turning into a national asset class. The men who controlled capital weren't just picking a current. They were picking the future shape of cities. Westinghouse could win the spectacle. But to win the country, he needed a project that proved AC wasn't just beautiful. It was unstoppable. And there was one place every engineer kept pointing to, because it was the purest test of distance and power: Niagara Falls. If AC could tame Niagara and ship that power outward, the war would stop being a debate about safety and start being a fact written into infrastructure. And once infrastructure chooses, headlines don't matter the same way. So after Chicago, the war of currents narrows into a final question: not which current looks safer, which current can own the continent. Niagara Falls was the test that propaganda couldn't survive. You can scare a city council with headlines. You can slow a rival with patents. You can poison a brand by tying it to an execution chair. But you can't spin physics when a whole region needs power, miles away, every hour, every day. At Niagara, the question wasn't which current sounded safer. It was which current could move industrial-scale energy without collapsing under its own weight. DC needed stations close to customers. That meant more buildings, more crews, more copper, more street disruption. It also meant more points of failure, more chances for a wire to fall, a worker to slip, a neighborhood to go dark. AC offered a different promise: raise the voltage to travel, lower it near the customer. One system stretched across distance, a grid that could grow without planting a generator on every corner. While Westinghouse aimed at Niagara, Edison's world was changing behind him. The electrical business on his side didn't stay a personal crusade. It became finance. J.P. Morgan backed consolidation, and in 1892, Edison's company merged with Thomson Houston to form General Electric. Edison's name still sold progress, but the machine now belonged to bankers and executives who cared about market control, not lab pride. Westinghouse didn't get a clean runway either. The war drained cash. The underbids, the lawsuits, the constant build-outs. You could win the public spectacle in Chicago and still get crushed by balance sheets the next quarter. Westinghouse had to keep building while being painted as dangerous. That's what makes Niagara feel like a knife-edge moment. If Westinghouse proved AC could tame a waterfall and feed a city, the war would tilt from opinion to infrastructure. And when the work began, it looked nothing like a newspaper argument. It looked like men in wet boots and heavy coats, hauling copper and iron, fitting turbines, bolting frames, running cable through cramped spaces that smelled of oil and ozone. It looked like long shifts under noise that never stopped, because a power plant isn't a showroom. It's a machine that eats mistakes. When AC power finally traveled outward and lit places it shouldn't have been able to reach, the effect was quiet and brutal. The fear campaign didn't vanish, but it weakened, because the public could now stand under electric light, powered from far away, and realize the world hadn't ended. That's how the war of currents actually ends. Not with Edison apologizing, not with Westinghouse celebrating, with city after city choosing what scales. Edison's dirtiest move, the attempt to tattoo AC with death, didn't disappear from history. It just stopped deciding the standard. The electric chair became its own dark story, separate from the grid that kept spreading anyway. And the men at the center didn't get clean victories. Edison helped create the public hunger for electric light, then watched control of his empire drift into corporate hands. Westinghouse proved the system that could conquer distance, then had to survive the financial bruises of winning. Tesla's ideas became the backbone of an AC world, while he stayed a symbol more than a ruler. So when you look at an American city glowing by the mid-1890s, you're not seeing one inventor's triumph. You're seeing a power war that taught corporate America something permanent. Patents are weapons. Courts are battlefields. Newspapers can be used like artillery. And if you can make the public afraid, you can slow a rival, even when you can't outbuild them. The last image I keep is simple. A line crew on a pole at dusk, hands steady, boots locked in. A transformer humming in a box that most people never notice. A city choosing the current that can travel, even if it was once sold as the killer current. And two empires learning that once the wires are in, the war doesn't get remembered as cruelty. It gets remembered as progress. Like the video, subscribe, and comment. Where are you watching from? This community is where old money power wars get unpacked without the polite version. If you watch the video to the end, do you think Edison crossed the line?